Thank you, Barbara, for that very kind introduction. Shabbat Shalom. Recently, I read an incredibly poignant letter to the editor in the Boston Globe. Commenting on the passage of time, a mother wrote, "When we took our youngest daughter to college several years ago, my husband teared up, and I thought for sure he was crying about loss, our baby going off and leaving us. But when I asked him, he simply said, 'I feel so lucky to be here to see this.' Well, that's me today. I feel so lucky that Mom and I are here to celebrate her 100th birthday. And that's why, of course, I recited the Shehechianu after Mom and I were called up for an Aliyah. A century of life. It's an incredible milestone that few people reach. And it's appropriate that we are celebrating while reading Parashat Hukat. As our Eitz Chaim Chumash tells us, and I'm quoting directly from the introductory paragraph some of you may have read, in the course of this parasha, Miriam dies, Aaron dies, and Moses is sentenced to die without reaching the promised land. A transition of generations is taking place. The narrative's center of gravity is moving farther from Sinai and closer to the challenge of conquering the promised land. Soon, there will be no Israelites left who actually stood at Sinai, only Israelites who have heard about it from parents and grandparents. And so it is in our world too. My mom can still vividly recall the Great Flood of 1936, as well as the Great Hurricane of 1938, which remains the most powerful and deadliest hurricane in recorded New England history. Does anyone else here remember those events? No, nobody. In the life of the Jewish people, milestone moments like a great flood, think Noah, are preserved in our canonical literature, principally in the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible. If the story, the foundational law, the critical decision did not get recorded there, it's been lost forever. We can't ensure that our personal memories, experiences, and values will be preserved for millennia. But I would like to argue today that we can canonize, at least for our families, the critical stories that we want to pass on. I'll suggest 3 ways to do that, and I'll also invite all of us to speculate on how Miriam, Aaron, and Moses might have responded if they had had access to the modern approaches that I'll describe. I'll begin first with a wonderful website called storyworth.com, which I used with my mom over the last 3 years. The concept is as follows. As often as Mom and I chose, Mom responded to an inspiring question or prompt, either suggested by Storyworth, chosen by me, or suggested by another family member. Acting as her stenographer and editor, I typed up and emailed her response back to Storyworth. When we were ready, all of the responses were compiled and printed in a beautiful hardcover book. And here it is. I just presented this to Mom last night. It says, for those you can't see, Minna Jacobson-Halperin, My Life Stories. The prompts that Mom responded to were incredibly varied. Have you ever experienced a severe storm? That's, of course, how I came to learn about her knowledge of the Great Flood and the Great Hurricane. Have you ever won anything? And with a little prompting from me, I found that for Mom, this was not just about winning lottery tickets, but also about winning in what you might call the lottery of life. For example, as Barbara's here, as Barbara just mentioned, having Frida Posnick as her friend for almost 90 years. And Barbara, you can come up and look at this later. There's a picture of Minna and Frida in here. And some deeper questions too. How did you think about Black people when you were growing up? And how do you think about them now? The answer to that question included me finding out that Mom and Dad had heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak at my aunt's synagogue in New Haven. And finally, a question suggested appropriately by my daughter Leora, who is a Jewish historian. That question was, what has changed? This is a question for all of us to kind of consider. What has changed about being Jewish in America in the last 97 years? How have these changes affected your life? And Mom's answer to that question provided a window into, among other topics, changing relationships between Jews and other ethnic groups, my grandparents' expectations regarding intermarriage, and German Jewish refugees arriving in Springfield, Massachusetts after World War II. Those are just 4 of the 48 prompts that Mom has responded to over the last 3 years, and which were compiled into this beautiful book. And I want to call out now here also the beautiful book by Fred Ezekiel, which I have here, What You Put in the Pot, because I see this as another example of this sort of thing. So I would say that these kind of books that I put together with Mom, that Fred put together with Jenny Brown, that these become, I'll say for Mom, this is her canonized story, that her great-grandchildren, born nearly 100 years after her, will be able to read many decades from now. So let's now shift back to the Parsha. Imagine Miriam the prophetess. What if Storyworth had been available in her lifetime? What questions would we, her extended family, have liked to ask her? How, for example, might Miriam have responded to these questions I asked my mother? What advice would you give to your great-grandchildren? Or, at what times in your life were you the happiest and why? Or some I did not ask Mom, but these strike me as interesting. What did you love about Moses and Aaron, and what really annoyed you? Or how did you feel as a woman about Moses and Aaron always being in the spotlight instead of you? I'll leave it to Kiddush to hear your other questions you might like to have asked Miriam and how you think she might have responded. So that's one approach, Storyworth. I highly recommend it. Moving on now to Aaron and to a second approach to sharing and canonizing your family's stories. When each of my 3 grandchildren was born, I set up a new email account where I, as their Saba, or grandfather, could write to them. Each email address is in the format from Saba to fill in the child's name @gmail.com. I've told my kids about these accounts and shared the passwords with them, but I don't expect that either my kids or grandkids will read these emails for many years, since the grandkids now are only 2, 3, and 5 years old. But the great thing for me is setting up these accounts has given me complete license to send my stories, my thoughts, my feelings into the unknown future whenever the Spirit moves me. So let me share 3 examples of letters I've written, of many actually. Not because I think you should be writing about these topics, but to spark you to consider what you might want to write to your kids or grandkids. The first example is an email I sent to my oldest grandson, Noah, when he was 18 months old. Noah was learning to walk and would reach for my hand when crossing a bumpy set of cobblestones at the end of his driveway, until he was willing to walk across without any assistance. Well, I saw that little story of the cobblestones as part of a larger picture, and I wrote to Noah to share my hope that he would continue to build the confidence to make those kind of difficult journeys on his own, while also being willing to take a hand when needed, and also being willing to lend a hand to others when they needed his help. A second example, I've enjoyed explaining my morning gratitude prayers to all of my grandchildren via the emails I'm writing. My favorite is what I had to say about Asher Yatzar, what often is called just the peeing prayer. When I say that prayer, I wrote to my grandkids, I'm reminded that if even one open or closed part of my body was not open or closed at the right time, I could be in pain immediately or even die. I told the grandkids, quote, if you've ever had a bad case of diarrhea or constipation, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And I went on to say to them, so here's what you might think of as a crazy idea. This is the great thing about writing these things into the future. You can say whatever you want. So here's what you might think of as a crazy idea, but please humor your Saba by doing this. When you finish reading this letter, the next time you go to the bathroom, say to yourself quietly, wow, it's really wonderful that little process of my body worked so smoothly. I am grateful. A final third example is the most difficult email I've written. About 2 years ago, my grandson Rami's parents were mourning the death of a dear friend who had died of cancer at the age of 48. I wrote the following to Rami. You too will be blessed to have people in your life who you love and respect and can't imagine living without. And then through accident or illness, they will be taken away from you. Perhaps their parting will be long and slow, as sometimes with cancer, and you will have the opportunity to say goodbye, to tell them how much you love them. In other cases, they will die suddenly and you will never see them again. I can't shield you, Rami, from these hard realities, but I can offer some perspective, having lived through my own losses. I went on to share my ways of responding and coping, and I concluded, Rami, it's hard to write to you about this topic, but I hope these words will be one source among many others for reflection and finding meaning as you confront your own losses and grief. These are just a few examples, and I hope you see many possibilities to take this in directions that are meaningful to you. So how might this concept of sending emails to your grandchildren have been applied by Aaron? Well, we know Aaron had 4 sons, Nadav, Abihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. The first 2 committed a grave offense by offering a foreign fire to God and did not live to have children. But Eleazar, who Barbara mentioned, and Itamar carried on the priestly line, and Aaron could have written to those grandchildren. Imagine Aaron during those many years of wandering in the desert with so many dramatic events unfolding in his direct presence. Imagine him sitting down in his tent with his MacBook Air. You know, you can do whatever you want with this. To write to Eleazar and Itamar's children. What stories he could have told. What lessons he could have imparted. Let's have some fun talking about that at Kiddush as well. Now, some of you may be saying to yourself, I can't do this on my own, using Storyworth or emailing my kids or grandkids. For anyone who feels that way, let me suggest a third approach to get motivated. Join a support group where each person commits to write each month and to share their writing with other group members. It gives you kind of a built-in deadline. For me, that came in the form of a Farther On group. You can check it out at fartheron.org. The concept is straightforward. 12 journals, each with a different topic, 12 people over 12 months. Throughout calendar year 2021, I was in such a group with a few people I knew before, but most of whom I had never met. Each month, a new journal arrived in the mail sent by the person who came before me in our 12-person circle. The topics were quite varied and thought-provoking. For example, how are you fooling yourself? Blessing and cursing, and self-worth. The last topic for me was this one, 3 stories, subtitled Critical Moments That Have Etched Your Character. And because I was the last person to receive this particular journal, that's why I still have it, I had the privilege to read 11 other people's responses before I put my own response into the journal. And then I scanned this, and I'm going to be receiving copies of all the journals digitally. One of the most powerful Farther On topics for me, and the one I want to relate to Moses, was making amends, the graceful art of repair. I had the opportunity when writing that entry to reflect deeply and to write about how clearing the air, apologizing, asking for forgiveness are essential ongoing parts of life. So let's now turn back one final time to this week's parashah. Imagine Moses receiving the same farther on journal on making amends right after he had struck the rock and been told he would not be allowed to enter the promised land. The invitation could be quite similar to the one I received. I've just adapted it a little bit to his time and place. Moses, the invitation might go, think back on all you've touched and allowed to touch you in your journey through life. Parents, brother and sister, Pharaoh and his daughter, the Egyptian guards you crossed paths with. Think too of the natural world, the bounty you've received, the gifts of beauty and nourishment like manna bestowed on you. Think too of values and ideals you've espoused through the years, stands you've taken and avoided, compromises and deals you've entered into with God or with others, and think of yourself and how you've treated yourself through the good and the bad times. Through all your years, and this is exactly how my invitation continued, but I'm addressing it to Moses here. The invitation continues, throughout all your years, who and what have you hurt, demeaned, diminished, misunderstood, ignored, forgotten, or betrayed? Allow yourself, Moses, to feel the pain and sorrow as those memories wash over you. Feel them fully before proceeding to respond to this month's journal invitation. So this is something else for us to discuss. What might Moses have written in his farther on journal in response to that invitation? Just one more topic for us to talk about at Kiddush. So to recap, I've encouraged you to do one or more of the following. Use Storyworth with your parents, children, or other loved ones. Begin writing meaningful emails to your kids and grandkids, no matter how young or old they are right now. Or join a farther on group to have the support and deadlines that can motivate you to write. Now, some of you might be saying, I'm not a writer. I don't know what to say. I'm not very articulate. I get that totally. Not everybody just flows into this like fish in water. But I do have one more suggestion, one more simple solution. Adapt and share the words of others with your loved ones. Perhaps those words can express your feelings far better than you could ever do it yourself. I'll illustrate how I've done this myself with a specific example from the writing of Albert Camus, the famous French writer and philosopher. It's a fitting way to end my Devar Torah on the occasion of my mom's 100th birthday. As recounted in his autobiographical novel, which I also brought along and which I recommend, it's called First Man. Camus was born into abject poverty in colonial French Algeria. At the age of 10 or 11, his widowed mother felt there was no choice but to take him out of school so he could go to work and help support the family. However, there was a teacher named Monsieur Germain who saw Camus' incredible potential, arranged for Camus to get a scholarship, and kept persuading his mother over the years to keep him in school. The rest, you might say, is history. Many years later, when Camus received, this is the part that I really have trouble with, but I'll get through it. Many years later, when Camus received the Nobel Prize in Literature, he wrote a short letter of gratitude to that teacher. That letter still brings tears to my eyes every time I read it. And my adaptation, and this is what I'm suggesting, you can also adapt other people's words, may do the same. Here's what Camus wrote to that teacher. Dear Monsieur Germain, I let the commotion around me these days subside a bit before speaking to you from the bottom of my heart. I've just been given the Nobel Prize, far too great an honor, one I neither sought nor solicited. But when I heard the news, my first thought after my mother was of you. Without you, without the affectionate hand you extended to the small, poor child that I was, without your teaching and example, none of all this would have happened. I don't make too much of this sort of honor, but at least it gives me the opportunity to tell you what you have been and still are for me, and to assure you that your efforts, your work, and the generous heart you put into it still live in one of your little schoolboys who, despite the years, has never stopped being your grateful pupil. I embrace you with all my heart. Signed, Albert Camus. So with full credit to Camus and not feeling I can say it any better, I turn now back to Mom. And I say, I don't make too much of this sort of honor, being invited to share my Devar Torah at Temple Emunah today. And this is a direct quote, basically, from Camus, but it applies to me. But at least it gives me the opportunity to tell you, Mom, what you have been and still are for me, and to assure you that your efforts, your work, and the generous heart you put into it still live in me, your son, who, despite the years, has never stopped being your grateful child. I embrace you with all my heart. Shabbat shalom.